diversity, equity, and inclusion consultancy. One of the things we do is help corporations move from being an ally to an accomplice, and we do that by helping organizations think about their workplace, workforce, marketplace, and their community activity.
Next, we have George Middleton. George is a licensed mental health therapist and an active member on the board of the Indie Black Chamber. George.
Good evening, Mark. Yes, George Middleton. I am a therapist promoting a series of works addressing the connection between mental health and race ideology. And I serve on the board of the Indie Black Chamber of Commerce. And my hope tonight is that we can bring the intervention component to the diversity training, implicit bias training. And hopefully after the end of this discussion, we will encourage people to become part of the Indie Black Chamber initiative called the Disparities Initiative.
We'll look forward to learning more about that during this discussion. Kit Malone is an advocate and educator with the ACLU of Indiana. Hi, Kit.
Hi, Mark. Thank you. At the ACLU, I lead our LGBTQ rights project, which is an all-fronts effort to work in the legislature, on the streets, and throughout the state to defend the rights of LGBTQ people in Indiana.
Yesenia Tostado is the co-chair of the Mayor's Latino Advisory Council and the executive director of Project Azul. Yesenia.
Hi, Mark. Happy to be here with you all tonight. So Project Azul, we're a nonprofit organization focused on identifying individuals who would like training and financial assistance to transition from underemployment or unemployment into full-time positions that offer a pathway to career advancement. We work with systemically marginalized populations, a large population of immigrants, Latinos, Blacks, African Americans, and other populations. And I'm happy to be here with you tonight.
We're glad to have you. Thank you, Yesenia. And last but not least, we have Chris Hamberg, who is the executive director of Indie Pride. Chris, thanks for being here with us.
Thanks for having me. Indie Pride is an organization that educates, that advocates, and builds community in the LGBTQ community here in Indianapolis. And we're working really hard to make sure that everybody knows that we are Hoosiers like everyone else. And I do have to say hello to my husband, Jason, and the kids. So hello.
Hello to everybody. We welcome that. So over the last year, we've been hearing a lot more about a movement of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so I just want to hear from you. What did those words mean to you? And why are these three words? Why is this so important in the workplace, especially now? Marshawn, we'll start with you.
Certainly. So I think it's been said that diversity is being allowed to be at the dance, inclusion is being able to pick a song, and equity is probably being able to be at the planning committee to decide if you're going to have a dance in the first place. And so I think what we're talking about now is making sure that employees are able to bring their full self to work, or I guess now to Zoom, in order to make sure that they're really not only feeling like they're contributing to the company, but also getting the fulfillment that you generally should get from work. And so we have 5 generations in the workforce right now, and there's a lot of different ideas about how work should happen and leadership styles and things of that nature. I think what we're coming to is a consensus that folks have to be recognized both for their differences and also their contributions.
I like that. That's an interesting way to look at, what those words mean and the differences, because each one does mean something specifically different. And liking it to prom songs or the dance is a great way to put it. Yesenia, what do those words mean to you?
Yeah, so I think, Marshawn really laid it out very nicely. They all do have very different meanings, especially in the workplace. And diversity typically just refers to the differences. So the dimensions of diversity. So whether that's gender, religious beliefs, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and other demographics. And what we know is that when a workplace is more diverse, companies have a competitive edge. However, you have to go beyond just diversity. You have to go beyond checking the boxes of having different groups included. You have to look at equity, which is identifying what are the gaps. What do we need to implement in order to make sure that we're addressing any needs of particular minority groups. So one example of this could be an effort for targeted upskilling to diversify your leadership or to create a leadership pipeline within your company. And in inclusion, I actually see that as the environment where employees feel that they belong in the workplace and where they can bring their uniqueness to the work and where it's valued. So basically, it's a creation of strong social ties where employees feel valued and safe. We know that inclusion, if there's an inclusive climate in the workplace, it enables employee well-being, learning, and higher performance, and also increases engagement and retention.
Do you think companies understand that? Or do you think they're getting that?
I think they're starting to dive into it. I think we've seen a lot of companies come out with very public statements, but it's really making sure that companies go beyond that public statement and really dig into organizational issues where we'll really see things start to change.
George, what do those words mean to you? Equity, diversity, inclusion?
Well, in the context of the current state of the social fabric of our country, I'm coming more from a clinical or therapeutic perspective. And I see those three words as a conflict between our general collective belief system and the stated values that we claim. And often I say that to mean that what we think consciously often is betrayed by what we really believe subconsciously.
Kit, talk to me a little bit about the inclusion part of this conversation. Yesenia mentioned, and as did Marshawn, that is having a seat at the table and feeling like you can help plan, that your ideas are included. Talk to me a little bit about what that word means to you.
It's so important. I think that this conversation often stops at diversity. And I want to recognize that when, of course, diversity is important. It's something that we should aspire to, but diversity itself, without that, without the other two, without, equity, and without the ability to plan, without the ability to set policy in an organization, diversity isn't sustainable. If employees are just there to fill in a slot, but are not supported all the way up in making the decisions, then the company is going to miss opportunities to preserve and expand that diversity that they claim they want in their, in the statements that they may make. So it's absolutely vital, if you're to have sustainable diversity, that you include people, that people be part of it, that people be in leadership. Specifically for the affected communities that companies may identify that are not present in their organization. If they want those people to be there, there may be a reason those people aren't there. And I think that employers need to be able to examine their own ways of doing business to understand how they might be actually excluding people.
Chris, do you think it's also important to, for these staff members, for these companies and employers, to encourage their workers to get to know each other and ask questions and understand where each comes from?
Oh, I think that relationship building is key to equity and inclusion, absolutely. But I think oftentimes people who are from marginalized groups, go into a company and that is predominantly white, predominantly heterosexual, predominantly cisgender, and they then become the expert for their marginalized group. And so every time there is an issue in the news, or every time there's a question that may not even be appropriate, that could be easily Googled, they run to that person. And that becomes pretty exhausting pretty fast. And so sharing from personal experiences and seeing that person as an individual who has a wealth of background, experience, and knowledge is really key. That the person you're trying to connect with has a family or has a chosen family and all of that. So trying to get to know the person rather than the label.
And how do you do that? And this is a question I'll open up to everybody. How do you open up the conversation without making someone the token and spokesperson for their race, orientation, religion, country they're from? How do you get the conversation going without feeling like you're turning someone into a symbol or a token?
Well, Chris just said that perfectly with regard to labels. And that gets into my initial assertion of belief systems versus our conscious intent. And the labels have a significant subconscious impact. So we're often fighting the belief systems associated with the labels behind them, with whatever area of diversity you want to pick. So when you ask, how do we get to know each other? It's almost impossible to get to know each other through a label. So until you do the work of dissecting the label and what your honest impression is of that versus the reality of what the person is, you're going to be in more of a delusional or fictional aspect of the relationship. And many of us don't even know who we are. We identify by these labels, and we also internalize a lot of the beliefs associated with these labels. So, part of the in the video "Hidden Bias of Good People," Dr. Marx really brings this to light, and he informs us at the beginning of the show that training, diversity training, implicit bias training, those are awareness initiatives. But to do the work, you actually have to work, and we're stopping short of the work. We're acting as if the training is synonymous with change, and it's not. So we have to start the boring part. I know what I'm saying is not sexy, it's not exciting, it's not all, it's not going to bring people in and say, hey, I want to buy a ticket right off the bat.
Or it might.
Okay, but the bottom line is, guys, after the flash and dash, after the entertainment, after the nice colloquialisms and videos, we all have to roll our sleeves up and individually do the work to cut through these labels and assess our own belief systems about what all of these identities really mean.
Let me ask you something for our viewers who are joining us here then, and any of you can chime in on this. Let's talk about what the first step of that could be then. What would be the first step in doing the work for ourselves so that people can get started?
So part of what we do is we talk about the distinction between allies versus accomplices. We see allies as taking action, sometimes performative action. Maybe that looks like doing a statement or asking what book should I read, or where are the Black restaurants? Accomplices actually do the research. They do the work, as George said, Dr. Middleton said. They go and they find the books, and then after they've done the research, they ask questions. If they're looking for opportunities, they don't ask someone, they do their own research. And so it's really about doing the work of engaging other people. I think a good first step that we like to do is have people do an implicit association test, understand where their biases are. And then the work is, learning about that bias, doing research, working, trying to engage people that have that trigger that bias. And so that you begin to shape your mind and change your mind to deal with your lack of knowledge that you're imposing on someone. So it is, as Dr. Middleton said, work. And so we look at that as a distinction between allies who make statements, which allies, making statements are important sometimes. But what we really need are accomplices at this moment who are focused on the project of equity.
I want to offer the mildest possible pushback on Dr. Middleton, specifically to say that I don't think it's boring, and I think the process of, and I even say I'm vicious. I want to say that having authentic relationships with people is exciting. It enriches your life. And I think that's something that's often missing in workplaces when we sort of focus on policy and how we're going to train people to understand diversity. The best workplaces, the most authentically diverse workplaces that I've been in, were there because people were just having authentic relationships with one another. And you cannot come to understand a minority group without having real friendships, real partnerships, and that's what moves you away from treating people as tokens, and working with people as fellow professionals and understanding the way that they may work that is unique because of the background that they bring.
You get to know the personality, and when you get to know the person themselves, everything else is on the outside, but not defining who they are.
And you learn it organically. And that's what's important, is that you learn about people organically, the way we all learn about people.
Just a point of clarity. As much as it sounds good, I'm actually not a doctor, and unfortunately, I don't even get to play one on TV. So it really sucks. But I love the word that Kit used, which is authentic, and authenticity is often what's missing in this whole process. And so I love what Marshawn's approach is with regard to determining allies and accomplices. I would offer an additional step, and maybe even prior to that, which is first, always begin with yourself. Often these conversations on diversity begin with somebody should do something, somebody else needs to do something. And so we automatically start with putting the onus of responsibility on another person. I'm challenging us collectively to begin with ourselves and learn and address our own authenticity. These labels are not as authentic as sometimes we want to profess that they are. Mm-hmm. And so we have to do that work with ourselves. We can't help someone else if we're not in the best shape ourselves. Just like the lifesaver rule, the buddy rule. You don't go in after somebody and put two people in danger. So we have to first, before we get out there and start trying to do human service for others, make sure that we first have done the work ourselves. As a therapist, I had to, believe it or not, and people that know me to this day can't believe that I'm in the mental health profession, but that's another story. But you know, most therapists have had to go through therapy themselves before they're allowed to go and work in the general population, because we need to understand what our triggers are, what our emotional hurts are, before we can get out there and try to help someone else.
Like when you're on the plane, put your mask on yourself first before you help others, right?
Correct.
Love yourself.
WRTV has launched the Hiring Hoosiers project a couple of years ago, which helps people find jobs and training opportunities, and looks at some of the barriers that might keep people from attaining a job. And so in this discussion, we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I like to talk about some of the unique challenges and barriers that minorities might face when they're seeking employment. And Yesenia, I want to turn to you for this, because I know part of your work is really helping place people where they feel comfortable in good and good paying jobs as well. So what do you think are some of the biggest barriers in our area that are keeping people from attaining work when it comes to diversity?
Yeah, so I think one of the things is bias, right? We all know that there are bias. We all have personal bias, but there's biases in processes and in organizations. So understanding, the hiring process, or an organization looking at its hiring process to make sure that it is not having any implicit biases within that process. So looking at your job descriptions and making sure that they use language that is understandable, making sure that you're pulling out the skills that are essential for the jobs, looking at your website and your company culture and how it's portrayed. Does a person feel like they would belong at that company? Does a person feel like it would be somewhere where they could grow, where they would be welcomed? Also looking then within the culture, because a lot of times, like I think it was Kit who said, that diversity is something that is considered, but the equity and inclusion aren't considered. So a lot of times when a diverse individual gets into a position or gets into an organization, what they find is that the organization isn't willing to hear their ideas, isn't willing to let them bring their whole self to work. So they may then, leave the company. So not having those equity and inclusion pieces in the company culture really then doesn't help the company retain talented individuals. So also digging into, what is your company culture? Do you have a formal DEI policy? And that DEI policy is just a start. You really have to look at the practices. How are your managers embracing the DEI work? Because they are the most critical the most critical supervisor for employees. So you have to make sure that everybody is on board and everybody is practicing the standards that you expect for your organization.
And how do you, as an employee, make sure that's happening? How do you hold your company accountable for a mantra that it might have set up? You want to make sure it's delivering as well. How do you hold them accountable?
So go ahead.
So one thing that I would mention before letting Marshawn chime in is that I think one thing is that we do need to be self-aware, and we do need to make sure that we are modeling the behaviors that we expect of others. So as an employee, making sure that you're paying attention to, your team and their needs, and understanding the dynamics of the organization, and speaking out when you do face an issue, if you feel empowered to do so. Sometimes the issue is that we don't feel empowered to do so.
So
Marshawn,
I was excited to speak on this issue. One of the things that we're learning from the younger generation, younger employees, is that they have higher expectations relative to these issues. And part of the reason why we see corporate behavior shifting is because employees are demanding, and they're holding their leadership accountable for these kinds of changes, particularly on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's an exciting new development. I know that the Business Roundtable, some of the 200 of the largest corporations in the country, recently said that no longer could companies just focus on profit maximization, but they had to look at other stakeholders like employees, their contractors, and other entities, because that's just the way that business is going right now. And so it's to your detriment, really, not to focus on these issues. And I think Yesenia mentioned that earlier. But it's a remarkable space that we're in now, and I don't think it's going away.
I think so something that's just been rolling through my head is, we're talking pretty high level. And I think to really change culture, you do have to engage with managers, because so often marginalized people, will leave a company. I think it would be very easy right now to go out and get a job as a marginalized person, because everybody has got this, it's kicking in that they need diversity, and so they want the representation. But when you get in the door, you are scrutinized and you are held to such a high standard that it becomes impossible to live up to. And so it really is a matter of looking at, the managers, and are they treating everyone equally when we're looking at performance issues, and we're looking at, responding to emails, timing, or the ever elusive that I've heard a million times, which is, there's just something about that person I don't like. I don't know what it is, when it's pretty obvious what it is. So I think that companies, managers, those in positions of authority really have to examine those sort of statements and those practices once you're on the other side of the interview table.
Kid, is it worth, getting educated on what resources are available when you're holding your managers accountable for, maintaining a culture that is open and diverse? Working with the ACLU, a lot of people probably don't know where to turn and might feel helpless and might feel they have to leave to find another company to work for.
Absolutely. There are legal avenues. One hopes that in your journey as an employee that it doesn't come to that. But you can always file an equal opportunity employment complaint with federal government when you've been discriminated against, and that will begin an investigation. And there are, the ACLU typically only represents clients in discrimination cases who are suing government entities, but there are lots of, local, generally the City Bar Association offers the ability to search to find a lawyer that takes employment cases. But I think really the question about holding employers accountable is really more about, what do we do? What can you do as an employee who's, internally? What can you do to advocate for yourself? And, that is a really I just want to honor that that's a really complicated and dicey question. Employers hold a lot of power, particularly, and employers should recognize, particularly for people from marginalized communities, whether that's people, whether that's people of color or immigrants. It is harder to gain employment. It's basically the definition of what marginalization is. So there is a lot of pressure on people who are employed to find a way to get through what happens to them. And so, I know the larger question is, how do you advocate for yourself? But I think it's important to honor that it can be very hard to advocate for yourself when employment is scarce.
Yeah, Mark, you ask a twofold question. First, what are some of the typical barriers to workplace diversity? And then how do you hold companies accountable? From a larger systemic view, it's wrapped up in disproportionate treatments of systems that end up in outcomes of disparities. And what that becomes, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. They just turn on each other. And in the video, Dr. Marc's video, he states that implicit bias is a strong indicator of behavior. So if you reverse engineer the process, if you start from whatever system, education, finance, judiciary, law enforcement, and you look at the outcomes based on race and ethnicity, that will tell you where the implicit biases are. Because implicit bias, as Dr. Marx accurately put it, is a strong indicator of behavior. So in order to hold companies accountable, first, I would recommend changing the language, because once you start with language that is more penalizing, negative sounding, people go into defense mode, and you can't get anything done from a point of defense. Everybody retreats to their corners, rightly or wrongly. That's not even the point right now, who's right or who's wrong, because that's another paralyzing dynamic of human relationships. Is it's more important to not lose than it is to actually fix the problem, okay? So that's a huge problem we're facing right now. So we have to change the language. And you can't change language until you really change mindsets. And I like to quote Einstein, although let's make it clear, I'm no Einstein. But he says, in order to fix a problem, you can't fix the problem with the same mind that was used to create it. And often what we're doing is we're using the same discriminatory mindsets to fix a discriminatory problem. So we have to start, it's 2021. Everybody knows what's going on. What we don't have is an idea of how to fix it. On June 9th of last year, the City County Council declared just one aspect of the diversity issue, racism, a public health crisis. Now we've got the diagnosis, but we don't have the intervention. Except I will, at risk of sounding a little delusional, propose that the work that we're doing with the Indy Black Chamber of Commerce proposes this intervention to address the problem. But you first have to address the mindsets, and then, and this is right out of Dr. Mark's video, you have to work it. You've got to practice it. I don't know if you guys are athletes or golfers or whatever it is. There's a difference from practice and game time, right? And often we are trying to make an awareness program, a diversity training or implicit bias training. We're trying to make that all in one, and it's not. That's just the first step, the awareness. We're not creating a systemic structure to practice this new mindset. And most of us are afraid to even practice because we're afraid of doing the wrong thing. So when we talk about holding people accountable and penalizing, people don't want to make a move because careers depend on it, reputations depend on it. And we have to create a community of safety so that people can feel free to be honest about issues of diversity so that we can really get it out on the table. And then we've got to actually apply it. Actually apply it. Not just do the thing like, check off the box, but now we got to apply it.
I want to address I want to bring to this panel here an issue that you and I talked with earlier this week as we were preparing for this. And I had mentioned that, you're talking about tangible things that we can see moving forward. And you and I, George, talked about, and I'm going to say exactly what I had said before, companies in some states allowing women of color to wear their hair naturally in workplace settings. Right. And that was a tangible move forward. But you raised two good points in that that show why this really needs to take a good look at, why this was an issue to begin with. Right. And who is in control and who is giving permission and stripping that down.
I appreciate you remembering that, Mark. Yes. That's a great example. We often are using race and gender appointments and hirings and new policies as we've arrived, right? And in the language, it's the first Black this, or all those type of things, which has a deeper counter meaning. That it denotes a power differential. So when Black women are allowed to wear their hair in corporate environments, for me, that doesn't sit well, because that's telling me that you're allowing me to be authentic rather than accepting me for my authentic self. There's a difference. There's a difference between acceptance and allowing. Allowing means I still hold the cards. Acceptance means, hey, this is equal territory. I've internalized and embraced you, and vice versa. This is a collaborative environment. So when we're talking about areas of diversity and inclusion, I always like to ask the question, who are we asking to be inclusive? Who are we really asking to be inclusive? If you look at the statistics, what do the statistics say about who's being inclusive and who's not? And is the expectation of those in power for them to fix the situation for those perceived out of power, is that really helping? Or is that actually perpetuating the issue? So words are important. We use the words minorities and marginalized. I want to challenge those words, because what that does is it resets and affirms that mindset of disparities and disproportionate treatment. So even though we say we want to be fairer and kinder, if deep in my mind I see you as a minority, on any given day, I'm going to fall back on my subconscious default.
I'm going to take this next question around the room. I'll start with you, Chris, here. And in your careers, have you experienced bias or discrimination?
Yes. Yes. I started off my career as a youth minister. So, I was not out at the time. I hadn't accepted that of myself. I took a job teaching later in my career at a very well-known high school, and it took me 4 years. I was not in the closet before I took the job, and then at work, it was something that I was not supposed to talk about, and it was always unspoken. And I met with the union president, and she was very supportive, but I was told that the rest of the union leadership didn't feel like they had a dog in this fight. Then she and I went and met with school board members, with the superintendent, and I came out and said, I don't know how you want me to address this in this very conservative area of Hamilton County as a teacher, because I don't want to be accused of spreading the gay agenda. And finally, the school board approved a non-discrimination policy so that teachers could be protected for their sexual orientation and gender identity.
Your bold move changed protocol.
Yes. So I'm proud of that in my career, because I know that there are a lot of LGBTQ teachers at that school now. Go Greyhounds.
Greyhounds. Marshawn.
No, definitely. And I left the organization because, in fact, I did not see myself as a marginalized person or a minority. I saw myself as a powerful individual who I wasn't going to allow the institution to treat me like that. And now I appreciate, as Kit has mentioned, the complexities of how you deal with that situation in the moment. But I dealt with it and, just made a decision to move on. And it is complicated because one of the things you have to consider is that when you think about the Black community and its employment rate, for much of 2010 on up to even now, it's been in the double digits, even during good times in the economy. Indiana is one of those states where the Black unemployment rate was nearly to double the white unemployment rate as late as 2018. And so it is a challenge when Black people make a decision to stand up for themselves and step out and not allow themselves to be treated as a marginalized person or a minority person. And I think part of what you're seeing with this racial reckoning in companies all across the country, as Black people are standing up and demanding of their leadership that things must change. I talk to a lot of CEOs and that's what they're saying. They're saying that their employees are deciding that something has to change and they're demanding their leaders to do something different because we're in a different situation. I mentioned there's multi-generations in the workplace. There's a generation of workers that will just go to another company. Right now, you don't even have to live in the same city to work at a company. So It's changing. And there's even the issue of consumers and their relationship with companies. So the playing field is shifted on businesses.
I think you're right. I think that when the story broke here locally about the museum, the local museum, I think you saw a lot of reaction from consumers as well. To your point, Kit, have you ever experienced discrimination, bias where you work?
Yeah, absolutely. Not where I work currently, honestly.
Yes.
I mean, there's always, there's always interpersonal issues, but I'm really lucky that my team at the ACLU are just an incredible group of people. That has not always been true in my life. I think that is a common thread that you hear among, particularly women of trans experience. We face significant challenges in the workplace. I know that I don't want to go too deeply into the details of my own story, but I definitely went from someone who was a 20-year junior high and high school teacher who was award-winning to someone who had trouble getting a job at a coffee shop for a while. I love to joke sometimes that, now I pass non-discrimination law for a living. But I also think that that's a bit minimizing. I have a lot of privilege that a lot of my other sisters don't have. I'm lucky enough to have had access to higher education, to have had access to whiteness, to the fact that I'm white. Black trans women, Latinx trans women, often have a much harder time accessing the kind of respectability that I had access to, that enabled me ultimately to sort of pull out of that. So I'm always weary of telling, my story in a way that says, oh, well, she overcame these great obstacles. I think that, it is important to be someone who wants to overcome, but I do think we do have to acknowledge that the problems that we face are systemic, and that they are not, one person's success story does not mean that there is not a problem. I know I'm proud of the work that I've done in my life. I'm proud of the work that I do now. But I'm always conscious of the fact that behind me, there are millions of women who face poverty every day simply because of who they are.
And I have to say here that, as we move forward and move up, many of us are in positions that as we climb higher, it is still our responsibility to lift up those who are behind us. And I bring that to your attention just to say that you may have seen that you've had some privileges and been in a position to move forward. back and clear the way for more to come up. Yesenia, what about you?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of biases that I'm faced with are really, before I speak, a lot of people will look at my name and they'll have a lot of assumptions about, that I will speak with an accent, that I, do not have the qualifications to be in certain rooms or in certain environments because I'm a checkbox for a lot of efforts, right? So I think a lot of the biases that I've experienced just growing up have really been related to just not being good enough, or that perception that I'm not good enough to be in certain spaces. So that's something that, constantly, especially when I was younger, was really challenging for me to overcome and for me to really understand, because, like Kit mentioned, I have had a lot of privilege. I was born in the United States. My parents are immigrants. So I observe the discrimination that they face because of their accents and because of, not always knowing the cultural norms of the United States. But I grew up in the United States, so I have that advantage of being bicultural. I understand my Mexican culture, but I also understand how to navigate life in the U.S. as if I am, an American, because I am an American. But that perception that I am not, or that I have to justify my Americanness, or I have to justify my parents' immigration story as to why they came here. That's something that continues to be just, brought up in conversations and brought up in situations that I'm faced with.
George, we'll round out with you. Have you been discriminated against? Have you seen implicit bias against you?
It occurs every day. It can be overt, it can be covert, and it can be totally invisible. There are some people in the work that I do that will actually say, well, I've never experienced racism. And statistically, it just is not true. Bias and discrimination are intricately woven into the fabric of our society. And it's to the point to where it is at toxic levels now. Watching the Dr. Mark's video, I was surprised. I'm really in this work, but I can always learn something new. And I learned through his work, his presentation, that the most discriminated group right now in America are the elderly, which, you don't really hear a whole lot of fire-passioning news about discrimination of the elderly. But that's an area that most of us who are lucky will get to. So when I think of bias, we have to address it at the root. We have to address bias at the root. And before you can have a bias, you have to have a belief. And I think people tend to separate the bias from their thinking, their thought process. It's as if it just appeared out of nowhere. But we have beliefs in this country that are different from other countries about the elderly. We have beliefs in this country different from some other countries about gender and skin color. And so dealing with it at the bias level is important, but I'm challenging us to really even go one step further and address it at the belief level. When you get into the areas of the LGBTQ, that is strictly belief system stuff, that some people have been raised up in a traditional environment. And when I make these comments, they're not disparaging, they're not criticizing, they're just objective truths, okay? Because this is what's getting in our way. I really appreciated Dr. Mark's approach. First of all, he's a psychologist and he's a social scientist. So we have to be able to look at things in a more dispassionate and more objective way in order to get an effective solution. And so in order to address bias, we really have to go back and examine what formed that. So for example, when I was little, I was sharing this with my brother a couple of days ago. I hated spinach because at that time, probably in my mindset, my belief system said it's not sweet enough. Well, as I got older, for some reason, I love spinach now. I love it now, right? But in my mind had changed and said, well, maybe I don't have to have everything sweet all the time. So once I did the mind work, that allowed me to more accessibly address my behavior. Now, I still like sweets more than I like spinach, but my behavior towards spinach is much more healthy now. And so it's important to acknowledge and be aware of our bias, but we have to be willing to go one step further and address it at the belief system level.
I think, if you don't mind, it really reminds me of some stuff that, I've gone through as a gay cisgender man, that so often I have friends that are from a conservative religious tradition, and they are against gay marriage, they're against any type of trans rights, they're against all the political issues. But they'll say, but I like you, and you're the good one. And trying to speak to even some of my best friends from childhood of, no, when you vote this way, when you support this person or this idea, you're doing it in direct, like an affront to me, because this is my lived experience. This is who I am. And so I think there's a circling it around that you get to know the person, not the label, and then have a better understanding of who they are.
So a question to you, Chris, on that, just to have this conversation, because, America is supposed to be about acceptance of all, freedom, pursuit of happiness, as long as we don't infringe on each other's rights. And even though I asked you this question of you, this applies to any area of diversity issues. Do you feel that those who disagree with that lifestyle choice, do you feel they have a right to their belief system?
I would not say that I had a choice.
Well, yeah, I didn't mean that you had a choice,
No.
But I mean in terms of that lifestyle period. So let me just take the word choice out of it, because I know that's a very, just that lifestyle period.
And again,
do they have a right?
Do they have a right to say that I shouldn't exist as a person?
No.
And I will respond, and because I have a lot of friends that are conservative Christians, and they always love to fight about our community, especially about trans people now, because they're the big boom.
Right.
And I say, well, then what's your solution? What do you want to do? What do you want to do with those of us that are part of the LGBTQ community? Like, if you don't want us to get married, I mean, that's the law of the land. What restrictions would you like to put on us so that you feel more comfortable?
Right.
You can absolutely have your faith and your religious beliefs, but also look at the whole story of your faith, right, your religious beliefs,
right,
not the cornerstones of what it is and what it means. So.
Well, I think that's the point I'm getting to, because belief is different from action, right? Mm-hmm. And I think in this discussion of diversity, we're in a point of paralysis, because we feel that we all have to be in 100% agreement before we can make a move forward, and that's just going to be totally impossible. Coming from a therapist perspective, I'm more understanding of how belief systems are developed. And so I understand why the person who wants to carry that Confederate flag, that triggers the other part of the community. But I understand where that belief system comes from. It comes from an environment that he's probably been nurtured by, people that are important to him, that have loved him, that have raised him, right? So when I look at it that way, it allows me to kind of disassociate myself and take it less personal, to try to find a more effective middle ground to communicate.
What would you say if I interjected the word respect into this conversation? I think as I'm listening to this, respecting where someone is or what they are or in their life or how they live or whatnot, is different than giving permission, so to speak, right, or accepting, but respecting. And I will say here, even the word lifestyle is a little bit, I feel like, maybe implicit bias.
Yes,
Because it's not like living on a yacht and exploring the world, or there's a difference there. But respecting that I have religious beliefs that say I can't support this, or respecting that I'm a man who loves another man, but existing and opening up the conversation without passing a judgment, I think is the point of reference here.
And let me.
I would love to interject really fast. First, Mark, thank you for that clarification about that loaded term of lifestyle. I appreciate that. I want to. I'm going to be the problem child here. I think that respect is great. I'm speaking as someone who is a lobbyist for the ACLU in a super majority conservative state. I would not get anywhere in my work if I was not willing to speak respectfully to people who are vociferously opposed to my continued existence. Who absolutely are engaged in policy matters that are intended to erase people like me from public life. And so I think that word respect, it can be very loaded. And, I say this a lot, I get paid to do the wild thing. I do that work, but beneath me, surrounding me, above me, is a community of people who are far more vulnerable, and who, that word respect is such I don't ever want to come out against respect. I think respect is so important, but I think it also, our calls for respect and for civility in the way we talk to each other need to also be tempered with an understanding that is not as accessible to everyone. And that folks who are living right on the margins, the expectation that they are going to find a very polite way to tell us that they are hurting can itself cause damage. And so I just want to throw up that cautionary flag.
And I'd like to say this on the same thing. Thank you, Kit. That I do some training on LGBTQ issues, and I do not buy into the caricature that if you disagree with political issues, that you are this horrible homophobic person that needs to be canceled. But in the workplace, you have to be professional.
Yes.
And that is what I'm looking for. And I think that's what most people are looking for. We're looking for professionalism. We're looking for equitable treatment, that we can do our jobs and we can go home and we can binge watch something on Netflix, and that's it.
That's my LGBTQ lifestyle.
That's my lifestyle. I'm not living the Marc Mullins life.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, I was watching a documentary on the 14th Amendment, and it talks about equal treatment. And obviously, there's a distinction between equal treatment and equity. Equity being giving you what you need versus equal treatment being everyone gets the same. And I think that's where you start to get into understanding and appreciating the culturally salient aspects of an individual in their intersectionality as you're thinking about all the different dimensions of diversity, as Yesenia mentioned at the beginning of our conversation. And so it is very much a challenge. I think it's been said that if you have diversity and inclusion and then you try to add on equity, you actually die, because you don't have the power that comes with equity. And so what I mean by that is, if someone respects me or not, they don't respect me. I don't really care. But what you do have to do when you're thinking about a job situation, or even when you're thinking about the government, because we talked about, I've been at the State House a little bit this week, there has to be equal treatment. And I have a right to pursue equity. And so that's just kind of what I wanted to add to the conversation.
Well, I wanted to take a risk and ask Chris that question, because it's important, an important skill to get through this whole diversity, inclusion, equity issue is to be able to have disagreements and still work together. And I love the way Mark put that, and I appreciate Kit's clarification on that as well. My father told me when I was a little knucklehead, he would say, you know, it's great to be liked and respected, but if you have to make a choice, it's better to be respected than liked. And so in the workplace, that's where respect really counts. Respect means I don't agree with you. I don't even really like you. But when I'm in the workplace, I'm going to respect you. And that's where we as a country collectively have lost or being challenged, really, because we're being challenged to really identify what America means. America is great if everybody, it's easy to be American if everybody agrees. But the point of America is for everybody to have a difference of perspective and still be American.
And still come to work, do your job that you're qualified to do.
Right.
And like you said, go home to your respective places without people judging you for what you're doing in your lives.
Exactly.
Final go round. This will be the final question for you tonight. It's been a great conversation. That's gone for an hour, so thank you. Tell me what each of your respective organizations is doing to work with companies or reach out to companies locally to push this forward, to open their minds through what you're doing. Chris, let's go ahead and start with you. Are you working with local companies and trying to, foster this environment of equity, diversity, and inclusion?
All the time. And Pride sometimes gets some criticism because we have a lot of corporate sponsors, but I meet individually with companies. I talk to them about their policies and their practices around DEI efforts before I allow them, or we let them sponsor our events because it's so important to the community. But we also host an employee resource, business resource group meeting every 2 months to talk about what issues LGBTQ folks are facing in the workplace. What are they doing to improve the work environment? And so we have, I'd say, about 30 plus companies from Central Indiana that participate in that, including a lot of the major employers in town. So I'm really proud of the work that we at Indy Pride are doing. And Kit Malone's coming tomorrow to talk to us about some State House issues. So,
are you welcoming more companies?
Absolutely. If you want, just send me an email and we'll put you on the list.
All right. George, tell me a little bit about what the Indy Black Chamber is trying to do in reaching out to companies in our area.
We have created what's called the Indy Black Chamber Disparities Initiative. And it is a proactive initiative attempt to get ahead of the systemic issues of disparities. And we're doing it in a totally unique way. We're using clinically based, evidence-based therapeutic intervention strategies, because that's what's missing in the diversity, inclusion, implicit bias piece, which they're great in terms of education and awareness, but they're leaving it to others to decide how they're going to apply it, if at all. And just a question to keep to have everybody think about while I'm speaking is, how many of us right now are actively on a regular basis working on our diversity and bias issues, actively on a regular and daily basis? I'm not saying for the on our own pieces, yeah, right? And I'm saying for the listeners, not necessarily the panelists here, okay? Because this is what we do. All right. So, but it's important to understand that when you get off this show tonight, what are you going to do tomorrow? Well, the Indy Black Chamber of Commerce has an initiative for you to be a part of. It's free for Indy Black Chamber members. So if you want to become a member of the chamber, then you can come on and get access to the program that way. But outside of the chamber, it's not going to kill you cost-wise to be a part of it. But it's a 3-step process: education, self-reflection, and then application. And we call this an intervention program to address this really public health crisis in all areas. So we're providing an intervention. If you want to be regularly involved, and if you want to have a solution to your particular organization that is serving the community, I implore you to please contact us at the Indy Black Chamber of Commerce and be part of the intervention solution.
Yesenia,
Yeah,
go ahead.
with Project Azul, we work directly with employers. So we train individuals, we provide career coaching, and then we work with employers to make sure we have good career opportunities for our participants. One of the ways that we provide additional support for our employers is we really do a thorough job in advocating for our population. So we help our employers understand the diversity of the populations that we serve, as well as any additional ways that they can support them. Some of the things could be providing English classes or, translating materials for populations who are English language learners. But then we also advocate for opportunities for growth within companies, because we don't just want to get individuals into positions, we want to get them into opportunities where they can continue to grow in their career. So we really work with employers to identify and advocate for opportunities for growth.
A great distinction there. Thank you, Yesenia. Kid, the ACLU.
Oh, yeah. Well, so obviously we have a reputation as being the people who sue people. But I will say that we are lucky enough in our advocacy arm to have a wide coalition of businesses throughout Indiana, large and small, who support us in initiatives to defend the civil rights of all Hoosiers on a variety of civil rights issues. They've supported us in the effort to secure reforms to policing in Indiana, to reduce imprisonment, to reform our immigration system and the way we treat immigrants in Indiana, to expand LGBTQ rights and access to the public sphere. And that is I'm really proud of that work. And I think that we have really done a great job in Indiana. It's one strength I think we have here is that we've done an excellent job of making the case with those business partners. And they in turn done an excellent job of really, really publicly stating that they think that discrimination is bad for business. And, I think that year after year, you can see in the laws that come out of the legislature that the stuff that doesn't make it through, a lot of that has to do with the efforts of those business partners who are not shy about saying, we think that what you're doing is going to hurt our bottom line. We think that you're going to make it harder for us to attract, a diverse population of employees. That goes really, in my personal history as an advocate. Of course, it goes much further back than this, but it's all the way back to the days of RFRA. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act, where we saw a wide coalition of businesses come together to say, we won't be able to hire a modern workforce if you institute sort of legalized discrimination in the state of Indiana. And their voices really were the reason that we were able to go back and undo, in the form of new legislation, the damage that did. And that's something you see repeated in smaller form every single year here in Indiana. And so absolutely. And, and just to be a little more granular, at the LGBTQ Rights Project, we've worked in partnerships with businesses to provide diversity training for LGBTQ employees. And we're always happy to do that if folks reach out to us.
Thank you, Kit. Marshawn, this as CEO of your management firm, Black Onyx Management, how are you working with local companies to help them with their equity and diversity goals?
Yeah, certainly. I think our program actually started with a survey of the Black community as well as a series of focus groups where we learned a couple of things. First, there was a desire to have a plan to address issues of dealing with workforce, engagement with the community, marketplace, supplier diversity issues, a whole host of things with the business community. So what we designed, and actually what Tamara Cypress designed for my company, she's our DSR lead, we designed a program called Indy Accompliship. And this is a program where we're trying to move companies to allies where they make statements to accomplices where they actually take action. We look at the workplace, workforce, marketplace, and community. There's a pre-assessment that occurs with that. And after the pre-assessment, folks have an opportunity, for example, to do implicit bias training with my company. One of the things that happens wrong with implicit bias training is, as George Middleton was pointing out, is folks will just say, hey, you have an implicit bias. But what really needs to happen is the work and telling people how to address it. So we do that as a part of the program. But the other thing we're going to do, we know, for example, this is Women's History Month, Black women in particular only make 66 cents to the dollar that any white man makes. And so we're going to ask about your disparities in wages. We're going to ask about your Black prime contractors. We're going to ask about, are you supporting Black-led initiatives? And if you're not doing those things, we will support you and help you in moving on each of those areas. And so our program, we're not here to embarrass anyone. We're trying to meet people where they are. We've already completed our first cohort. We're in the process of setting up our second cohort. We have large companies, small companies. We have schools. We have nonprofits all involved in the program. And I would also note that we are a proud member of the
Excellent. I want to thank you all for giving tangible ways that your organizations are helping move our area in a forward manner. I appreciate you putting out the resources that are available as well. And I appreciate your input in this conversation. This is just the start. This is just the beginning. And as we said, there's so much work to do, and you have to start in yourself. So I really appreciate the conversation. We will be posting this. And so whoever wants to watch it again or learn from it or get resources that were posted here or talked about here, we'll be able to put that out there for you. Again, thank you to our panelists tonight. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, and good night.